Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming out. I know it's and staying late. I know we're on the eve of daylight savings. I think we'll make it worth your time tonight. My name's Ethan. I am an outreach coordinator at the Pulitzer Center. And I'm very pleased to be here with Aaron Martin and Andrew Robinson, who are both Pulitzer Center grantees and science documentarians. So I'm super excited. Tonight we're going to present 6 films to you. And we've long been a partner with CUGH. I think this is our 11th year and counting. And so we run, for those of you who are at the award ceremony, we run a video competition. And we also discuss science storytelling and run a communications workshop, and that'll be tomorrow as well. So today's 6 films will kind of run the gamut. They will feature long COVID patients struggling to get adequate care. They will feature prenatal patients also looking for care. They'll feature illegal logging practices in the Amazon, and threats to biodiversity as the planet warms. I'm going to give a couple short introductions for our panelists here. We have Aaron Martin, immediately to my right. Aaron is an independent filmmaker from Detroit. He has worked with PBS NewsHour, Scientific American, and Bridge, Michigan. He, with us, produced the Great Lakes fish are moving north with climate change, but can they adapt fast enough? And this was for Scientific American. Andrew Robinson, who is on the far right of me and your left, he joins us from faraway Glendale, and his does a lot of work with his documentary partner, Dom Smith. And their work has been featured by Stat News, New York Times, Scientific American, and also PBS NewsHour. Their latest Pulitzer Center work that you'll see today is called The Vanishing Invisible Forests, which is about kelp forests in Monterey Bay. Before I turn it over to the folks and videos that you came here to actually see, I'm going to give you a quick run of the show. So first, we're going to watch Aaron and Andrew's films, which will run about 15 minutes. And then we're going to break. I'm going to ask some questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. And there are a couple mics down the aisle that you're more than welcome to use to ask your own questions. And so that'll last 10 to 15 minutes. And then we're going to watch the remaining 4 films and come back together at the end and talk more generally about science storytelling. So I'm super excited for tonight, and I'm going to stop talking now so we can get to screening the first couple of films, and then we can talk. All right, I think we're ready to roll. So my first question for both of you is an open-ended one. And I want to ask, what was the reception to both of these films? You can talk about it maybe in the context of your previous work, but also were there new audiences? So what was that like?
So I mean, this is interesting because we were just speaking beforehand that we both obviously work with Scientific American, and we were kind of exchanging stories about that. I think with Scientific American in particular, you're aiming for a relatively sophisticated audience when you're talking about science communication, and the story itself, in the case of the kelp, had been somewhat reported, or certainly elements of it had been reported, and we were, to excuse the sort of pun, looking to do a deeper dive and try and really look at the story, not just from a standpoint of, we learned a thing about the kelp and it's disappearing, but more a holistic, how are all these different elements engaged? And I think that's where maybe if you're talking about a response, like it's not like I have people coming up to me on the street and asking me about the kelp, but that's where I think people who did respond, and a couple emails that I got, that's what they were most interested in. I don't know if you want to speak.
Sure. Since you talked about Scientific American, my piece was also published in a statewide nonprofit news outlet called Bridge, Michigan, and that's where I received the most response from. It was very well received. Karen Arloff's research had partially been published before, especially the things that she had done with historical records in Ontario, but it had not been connected directly to the natural history element of how fish first colonized the Great Lakes, and were then using that same process to move north. And that dovetailed directly into some reporting that Bridge, Michigan was already doing about warming water in Michigan. So it was well received by the public, it was well received by the editorial staff, and it was really well received by the other reporter that was working on a similar story. So I was really happy with it.
Did you notice at all in this film, in the making of these films in particular, a shift in your relationship to expert sources? I know, that sort of, especially with social media, that has changed pretty dramatically. Did you notice anything, or was there, yeah?
Yeah, there was a lot of hesitancy at first on Dr. Ayala's part. It took a lot of emailing back and forth to get her to agree to sit down for an interview, and then it took a lot of emailing back and forth to actually schedule the interview. And I had to answer a lot of her questions about what I would be exactly asking about. I just gave her a general rundown of what we'd talk about. The story actually grew out of another story. I was actually interested in trying to figure out what the first fish into the Great Lakes was. And it turns out that Dr. Ayala is involved in genetic research, but they're not actually going to be able to get to the bottom of that to get a clear answer because the fish evolved elsewhere and migrated in. So as I was talking to her, the climate change story started to come together.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's what brought that up.
Like Dr. Pete Raimondi, who appears in the film that I did, he was happy to talk to me. He was perhaps a little reserved because he had gotten burned previously during the, when was it, 2011 Fukushima disaster? Was that 2011? Maybe 2010, was around the same time, or just prior to the sea star wasting syndrome taking off. And there were a lot of questions in the media about, hey, is this related? Yeah. And his answer was very scientific for somebody who was doing ongoing research. He was like, we haven't explored that hypothesis, so I can't rule it out. It was more or less, I'm paraphrasing him, what he said. And obviously it was eventually ruled out, but he didn't anticipate that being a problem. And the only reason that he went and scientifically ruled it out was because of the immediate panic that it caused to hear a scientist say, and then a headline get on the local news, like, possibly related, Fukushima disaster and sea star wasting syndrome, and people were buying gas masks in California and stuff, like getting ready for the fallout to affect their lives. And, it understandably so, it's scary, but also kind of speaks to the danger of talking about things in general scientific terms and then talking about things in what's going to make a clickable headline. And, that's where you can kind of run into trouble. And he had kind of, I think, learned to be a little bit more careful with his statements, just in case they would be taken out of context.
How did you choose your narrators? Because I know, they're very consistent throughout. You have Josh and Pete, and you have Karen, and I want to know, is there something, was it their research? Was it, their steadiness? Or what exactly drew you to them?
Well, Dr. Ayala is the best advocate for her own work, and because she's a lecturer, she was in the best position to make what she was doing accessible to a general audience. And I think in a couple shots, you can see her considering her answer as she goes through it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's the reason.
Yeah, I love, I just love Josh's enthusiasm, even when he's dealing with, serious and somewhat somber topics like die-off of species. He just loves what he's doing so much that I think that energy really comes through in a way that makes it more accessible. And I think, too, I just want to go to the people who are doing the actual work. There's one researcher who informs a lot of what's in here. Well, there's teams, obviously, but Tom Bell, who is involved with, I won't try and remember the exact name of his project, but there's a website called kelpwatch.org, and he's involved with the project to use satellite imagery to track, and so that's how they can estimate things like kelp population in a really wide area, is they're using satellite imagery to determine, where the canopy is showing up on the surface of the ocean. And so I talked to him extensively, and for a companion written piece that I did for the Monterey Herald, he appears in it a lot more, but I wasn't able to get him on camera for this one.
I see. And I mean, you touched on Josh's in particular enthusiasm, and you really sustained that thread nicely throughout, but it is still entwined with a little bit of bleakness. And I want to know, is there a method for walking that line? Because you don't want to convince your audience that there's nothing to do or nothing to be done, but at the same time you need to convince them how dire it all is.
Yeah. Do you have a good answer for that?
I don't have you know what, that's a question I don't have a quick answer for. Yeah, I mean, you just, as you produce your story, you find your way through to answering that question, how you're going to present the threat.
Yeah, and I think, if you're doing any kind of environmental reporting these days, you're going to encounter this constantly, and I think it's something that it can cause fatigue, and you're concerned about the sort of audience fatigue for this sort of a story, where if you're just constantly hitting people with doom and gloom, will they stop paying attention at a certain point? And, I was doing some reporting on the wildfires that we had in California that killed a number of the sequoia groves because of the just absolute, devastating temperatures that they were seeing, unlike anything that they had seen before. And one of the researchers that I was talking to was saying that, she deals with it constantly as well. She obviously loves trees because she's, got her doctorate in forest ecology.
Right.
And when she went into that field, she didn't go into it to document potentially the death of a species. And in some ways, she's a little bit resentful of her mentors because, they had all this time to study these beautiful, lush forests, and then now she's there to document how we destroy them, But on the other hand, she was saying that the way that she keeps sort of threading that needle and staying and moving forward is just looking for the people like her that are working to make a difference. And I hope through this sort of reporting, we're finding those people and telling those stories and giving people an opportunity. You can volunteer to help parse information on kelpwatch.org. If you live in a California coastal community, you can contribute to the documentation of the sea stars and the tidal pools there. There's a lot of stuff you can do as a citizen scientist, and I try to work that in where I can, on the website portion of these documentaries, and we can only each do so much, and there's opportunities there, and so if you can find that way in the story, I think it's useful.
This will be my last question before I turn it over to folks in the audience, but just briefly, I am interested, have you noticed a change or shift in attitude among outlets in your audience? Because you were saying yesterday, Aaron, I was really interested in, it used to be, right, 10 years ago you were reporting on the hypothetical effects of climate change, but now, in California, you were talking about in Detroit, you didn't have a proper winter, it's, these are happening now. So has that reached, your general audiences or outlets, or what have you noticed?
It's gonna start from this point forward because of what you just said, the lost winter that we had in the Great Lakes. We had very mild temperatures, very little snow, very little ice on the lakes themselves, which is something that needs to ecologically happen for the lakes and the surrounding ecology to be healthy. There's a statement that Karen Aloff makes in the film. She says that climate change is a slow-moving process, and because of our lost winter, it's no longer that. It's arrived for that area. So it's, from now on, it's the coverage is going to be very different, and the engagement with the audience is going to be different too.
Yeah.
We're not going to be, just like you said, we're not telling them what's going to be happening. We're telling them what is happening right now, and the effect that you can look out your window and see.
I'll turn it over then. If folks have questions about those specific, about the films we just watched, or questions about what we've been talking about, please feel free to step up to the mic and ask.
Hello. Thank you so much. These were wonderful films. I was just wondering if you have, in a lot of the conversations surrounding biodiversity and conservation, it relies heavily on these like large charismatic megafauna or flora, and that's not the only places that need help or need conservation and attention. And I'm just wondering how, as a documentary makers, how do you draw attention to those less charismatic parts of the world?
Well, that's a really good question, and that is something that does need to be addressed because, I mean, as things warm, we're going to see a lot of ecological change. Anthropomorphism, yeah, that's probably the best. Giving them some human quality that's relatable is probably the best way to engage a general audience. Finding a way to make that species. So the thing about films and journalism is that emotion makes good films and facts make good journalism, and so you have to strike the balance between the two, and that's what I would do in a story about, maybe a species that wouldn't necessarily be featured.
Yeah, that's funny. This is something that I talk about with my filmmaking collaborator all the time because, the charismatic species, you're exactly right. Like this story, we work in the sea otters because everybody loves sea otters, right? And in fact, if you go back and look at the coverage generally of this topic, if you were to do like a quantitative analysis of the headlines around this, the sea otters are going to be disproportionately represented. I kind of liked focusing on the kelp because kelp is algae, so this is, if you're going to talk about in terms of charisma, I guess giant kelp is the most charismatic algae that exists, but it's still algae, and I think that's exactly right, is that it's very hard to get people to engage with things like, oh, is it the biggest tree? The sequoias are dying? Maybe we should pay attention. But if the sequoias are dying, guess what? Everything else is dying too, and probably just as bad or worse, and so I think that you use it as a hook, use the megafauna as a hook to get to the larger story about biodiversity, or lean into it and say, hey, let's talk about, mosquitoes and how the death of, like, let's look at, what's the least charismatic species, and we could lean into that as maybe how I would do it. We talk about the loss of megafauna, and that's what gets the attention, but yeah, absolutely, the bugs, the algae, the grass, like these are the foundations of the ecosystems that we're losing and that we really need to be alarmed about. It's the bellwether, sort of stuff like that. Something that Josh mentioned to me in terms of kelp is he's like, it's bad that it's gone, but it's a weed, it's an algae. It can bounce back faster than just about anything else if given the opportunity. And so, that's maybe the other side of the coin there. What's not bouncing back, and I actually checked with some of the researchers yesterday just before coming here, is like the Pycnopodia, the sunflower sea star, is geographically extinct now pretty much south of Oregon, maybe a little bit in Northern California. And even in Alaska, where water is much colder, they are finding it, but it's in very small amounts, patchy populations. And there's not a lot of recruitment to those populations, a lot of successful breeding, I should say. And so the outlook for this biodiversity is still, very much in peril in those terms.
I think we can take a couple more.
I can
Okay.
We can hear you, yeah.
Yes.
It's awkward the way they place the microphones like this, but I'm very excited. I had no idea that we'd be able to ask questions. I thought we'd just watch the films, but I actually had lunch with my cousin today, who is a filmmaker for PBS, and we were actually just randomly talking about this exact conversation about how we imagine what a documentary is. And a couple of the things that we were talking about was how the sort of Netflix model has changed people's idea of what counts as a documentary. And so that's my first question, is how do you operate now in this new environment where people want things in this sort of sensationalized manner? And then two, I'm an anthropologist, and I have my students make short ethnographic films, so 3-minute films. I love it more than anything. And so what advice would you give to students who are just starting out making these films? Like, do you have any pointers that I could pass to them for that? So thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm thinking about an answer.
Well, first of all, if you want to reach out to us afterward, we should exchange information, because I'm sure we'd both be happy to follow up with your students. But
Can I ask what kind of anthropology?
I teach both language and cultural anthropology, but I've done films in both, but right now it's in cultural anthropology.
Okay. I think what I said just a couple minutes ago, emotion makes good films. So however you can engage your audience that way is the best way to start. And I like the idea that you have your students making 3-minute films. And I would encourage them to stick with that. That's often enough time you can deeply communicate science or any other subject within that time frame. I'm a strong believer in the 3 to 5 minute film. So I would say find a way to engage your audience's heart as much as their brain.
yeah, and you mentioned the sort of Netflixization, if we want to coin a term, of documentaries. And I was looking at a statistic because I was curious, like, what are the subjects of these documentaries generally on streaming? And 9 out of 10 are true crime. Yeah. Of all the documentaries that you're going to find on a streaming platform. And then that remaining 10% is everything else, and then generally of that, that little slice of the pie, the rest of that is going to be a biography of a famous person is going to be most of them, because you've got, if you're thinking from a sales perspective, we've got the name recognition of, whoever it is, let's say Jimi Hendrix, and like people want to know about Jimi Hendrix, so you get a documentary made. But so that's going to maybe even be like, and now I'm just going to shoot from the hip and say like that's another 90% of that remaining. And then so you're down into the fractions now of the rest that's going to be your environmental and everything else. And so so it's good and bad. I think on the one hand, if you are working down there in that niche, you don't necessarily have the expectation that it's going to be a true crime documentary, have that level of sort of like the thriller aspect of whodunit. At the same time, you can absolutely engage with all of the storytelling tools to make a compelling story. What you were talking about with like the heart and the mind, I would say if you think about like some of our oldest stories are myths and fables, are often dealing with nature and how things are and why things are the way they are. And so if you can take a page from that book, this is something I've been thinking about recently, which is why I'm saying it, but take a page from that book and like how can we engage in telling those stories? Now we're armed with more knowledge, we're armed with pedagogy perhaps, but at the same time, we're still answering these fundamental questions that people have been asking forever. Mm-hmm. And we can use the same sort of format and tools.
And we have time for one more before we show the remaining films. Go for it.
I wanted to say thank you for making those films and sort of pertaining to the uncharismatic microfauna. Yeah. I'm a marine microbial ecologist.
Oh, great.
And studied films on kelp and rocks, but I wanted to make the connection and wonder if that's the way you could bring it in, these bacteria and viruses like I study and many people study, is that the microbiome that's around the kelp or on the starfish, as you have a temperature spike, it changes the microbiome, and that's where the disease window comes in, and that's very similar to what happens in humans and their microbiome. And so if you could weave that into your videos along with the otters and kelp, weave those viruses and bacteria changes and the ecological changes that I saw in my.
In terms of that, speaking specifically of this story, you'll notice that we're calling it sea star wasting syndrome now. It's something that's generally been, like this syndrome has been described back to the 1970s when it was called sea star wasting disease. Like there was an example in the Gulf, and that they were calling it a disease at that time. And now they're calling it a syndrome because, as of yesterday when I was checking on it, they still really don't know. It is a confluence of all these things. They know it's correlated with the warming temperature of the water, which is why in the areas that are still warm, you don't see any of these sea stars anymore. To give an example in a different species, the ochre sea star, which is a rocky tidal sea star up the coast, the Pacific coast of the United States or North America. It hasn't been quite as devastated as Pycnopodia, but it has also disappeared significantly anywhere that it's warm. And the way that has disrupted the environment is because it grows in the rocky tidal pools, mussels. So in the Monterey Bay, in addition to the destruction of kelp and the outbreak of these urchins, there's outbreaks of these mussel beds that are overgrowing because they used to be eaten by the ochre sea star. So any one of these predators being knocked out is having a pretty dramatic and visible effect on the biome. And so maybe that's another way you can engage with these sort of microscopic stories is like, where do they change something that we can see? In this case, the sea star's disappearing and then you've got the overgrowth of the mussels or the disappearance of the kelp or something like that. But yeah, it's a tricky one, and it's always something that you have to engage with carefully when you're talking about microscopic stories, unless you're going to do full graphics and just go into the microscopic world if you have the ability to do so.
Yeah. Well, I think with that, we're going to show the remaining 4 films, and that should be around 40 minutes. So stick around. We'll have more conversation afterwards. Notice what surprised you, what was weird about this viewing, what sticks out. I think upon seeing these videos, again, what really interested me was the focus on patients and victimhood and kind of the complications, especially in the Outlaw Ocean project that we just watched. It's not something I remembered from reviewing the films when I last watched them, but there's a really, victimhood is pretty central. So I guess I'll lead with that.
There's something that I was just thinking of is, we have a disparate, quite a wide spread of subjects. I think you mentioned, the wide gamut that we run at the top. And yet, so much of all of this is sort of about the tangled webs we weave, whether that's international commerce, our food chain, the biodiversity in the environment, which is being affected in so many different ways. This sort of network effect, if you will, in all of these things, or perhaps even a single person who's experiencing a cluster of symptoms and ailments. It's the sort of, I guess that was kind of what struck me. If you were going to try and describe a theme that kind of comes through all of these, aside from generally, health, global health.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm still considering my answer. I was struck by how universal story structure is and how we're all kind of using the same foundation to tell very different stories. That's what struck me the most about all of the films.
Yeah, yeah. I also want to ask, with the last film in mind, it's curious because it's fictional, in its telling, even though it is, based on reporting. And I wanted to ask, given that you are both documentarians, like what role do you think, a fictional narrative might have in science reporting? Does it have a role? I mean, obviously they're two different things, right? We're talking about the brain and the heart. But is there, something compelling about using fiction, and where might you not decide to use it?
Well, I know it's been done before. There was a British film that was made in the 1960s that used medical research from the atomic attack on Hiroshima, research done by academics, public statements made by politicians and other figures to build a fake news program that showed what a nuclear attack on Britain would look like. And it used as a way of engaging the audience to think about, are you prepared for this? Are we being prepared for this? How should we react to it all? And there are other instances within documentary filmmaking of using fiction. I'm fine with that, as long as, like in this piece, you tell people that this is a fictionalized account based on reporting. In science, I can see it used to communicate things, especially related to human health and advances in medicine.
Yeah.
I think that would be an appropriate use.
I think, what it reminded me the most of is anybody who's ever watched like a nature documentary that constructs a little story or a life of like a specific animal. I can with some confidence say every single time that is footage collected over months and months perhaps of many different specimens that they have strung together to create sort of this archetypal story of like a particular lizard or whatever it is, This felt like it was engaging with the story in the same way, which is, we've collected all these pieces of evidence, maybe things that they've heard from the fishermen, from the report, the science and all the reporting that they had done to construct this sort of like story of an archetypal fisherman's experience on the squid fleet, which I thought was very effective, and I was just mentioning that they shot the hell out of it. Like it was really well done. The access that they have, I'd love to talk to the filmmakers just to figure out like how they pulled that off to have that sort of access to one of these ships. But yeah, I'm fine with it, again, as long as you're very clear about it and that it's supported. I'm sure we could go back and read all of the reporting or the other individual pieces that they filmed that supported this sort of like, what a great way to like get us engaged, and then if we're interested in following up, we can go see like all the reporting that they did.
Yeah, and you're talking about stringing together, right, a coherent narrative out of many different in say nature documentary specimens, and it does have me thinking a little bit about the use of graphics in Sao Paulo's piece, in that it's creating linkages. The graphics are creating linkages between systems and people in ways that you might not otherwise be able to convey in video. And I wanted to get your thoughts on using graphics in particular, because they can be really effective storytelling tools, but they also, it felt, especially in the early 2010s, that there was a period between, BuzzFeed and Vox that there was overkill.
The probably best example, yeah.
So, when do you think those are effective in terms of, kind of cohering a narrative, and when do you think they border on, perhaps cartoonish, like?
I only try and use them when absolutely necessary. I try and focus on the person as much as possible, because I think, again, going back to emotion, that's where the emotion is, not in the animation. So, my own personal approach is to use it sparingly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it helps when you're talking about esoteric or sort of abstract ideas, or, you're trying to bring in all these different things and show how they're related, in the same way that if you're writing a textbook and you need a graph, but they can be abused in the same way as well, because, since it's entirely constructed, it's easy to make a seemingly compelling argument that will resonate probably better than somebody actually sitting and reading your published paper. So it has the same pitfalls as any sort of like visual abstraction and condensation of the information to like you're putting two things together that maybe never were actually together, in real life, conceptually or physically, and so I think there's an argument to be made that it's extremely effective in certain topics and health in particular, when you're dealing with, like we'd done, back when CRISPR was like the big news. I can't tell you how many things I did for Stat News that had to do with CRISPR, and we were animating strands of DNA and stuff like that. It helps quite a bit, visualizing stuff. I think if you're using it to do stuff that you could have filmed, then I'd ask, like why. Maybe it was impossible for you to get there, or it just wasn't going to happen, but maybe consider why you're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, and all of this too is about representation, right? Because you're working within the limits of the medium, and I guess this is related. But when have you had sources come to you and say, hey, I really appreciate it. I feel accurately portrayed. That's like one of the biggest successes I hear from journalists. And conversely, are there stories when people have come to you and been like, hey, I don't feel like my research or my character or whatever was accurate?
I've kind of got one, in the reporting around the giant sequoia fires. There's a particular researcher that I was interviewing. She's a great communicator and she's very passionate. And she's particularly great in this area because before she became an ecologist, she was actually a firefighter. So she's lived that life and then gone on to study fire ecology. And she's very passionate about her work. And during my interview talking about her experience with these fires, she became very emotional and she cried. And in talking with her about the piece and what we could use and giving her a chance to compose herself, we ultimately decided to use a little bit of that in the piece, and I think it was very effective. It's one of my favorite pieces that I've done. At the same time, like I wanted to be cognizant of her position. She doesn't want to be the fire ecologist who just cries when she talks about trees, to be known that way, And I think, and I've worked with her subsequently, but I do think that she is more reserved now after that, both perhaps because of that particular piece, but also because she did a lot of interviews and became emotional in other pieces as well, and understandably so. And I think it's also an unfortunate reality that, as a woman in academia, there is perhaps a stigmatism against being emotional around your work, which I personally think is pretty silly because you don't study trees or bugs or kelp or whatever without being passionate about it. And so to pretend like you live in this completely clinical research world all the time is to deny the essential sort of motivation for you being there in the first place. But I think that that's something that has given me pause subsequently in how I represent my subjects. So not necessarily about the factual content, but representing the person, the researcher. If they're nervous or if they're emotional about the particular subject matter, I feel a duty to communicate the reality of the situation, and I also feel compelled to make a compelling piece by engaging with those emotions, and that's effective. But at what cost? I'm having to weigh that, and I think I consider that maybe a little bit more than I did before going into that piece.
I thankfully have not had a researcher come back to me and say that they felt like they were not accurately represented. In non-science pieces, I've run into how to represent people. When I covered the Flint water crisis, I made the mayor of Flint cry by asking her if she thought I asked her if she thought Flint was the most important city in America, and she broke down. And that was kind of shocking to me, and we avoided it when we put the piece together. But yeah, I mean, mostly all of my responses from researchers that I have spoken to or that have appeared in things that I've done have been positive.
I have a couple more questions before I turn it over to the audience. You mentioned that in watching the films, your experience was that the story structure was very similar throughout. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you think it is that that story structure is effective?
Because it's been developed and it works over time.
Yeah.
It's just a time-honored way of putting things together.
Yeah.
And we know that it works, so we rely on it. But I mean, remember, it's just the foundation. It's not the house.
Yeah.
So you can build, you use that foundation, and then the house can look like, it can be a square. It can look like something Frank Gehry did. It can be all of these different things, which is what I saw in the pieces that we just watched. But yeah, we all use this like setup, middle part where there's conflict, resolution, story structure, because those three parts work perfectly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of, yeah, I mean, if you go and read like a bunch of newspaper columns, you'll kind of find the same thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and you'll see tools and like ways that people, we'll start with a hook, like let's have people asking questions right at the beginning. Where are we? What's happening? You know, like, am I looking at something, a spaceship underwater, and then, okay, it's a squid ship. You know, like there are different variations on sort of the theme, but particularly when you're dealing with trying to communicate story. I mean, we call them stories in the news, and we call them, you know, stories when we're talking about them in terms of documentaries, and do it in a relatively short period of time when you're talking about short form. Yeah, there's only so much. I mean, certainly there's some experimental stuff, but I think there's also a desire to be functional when you're talking about documentary that perhaps leads us to follow a little bit more of a pattern.
And that sets up, I mean, my next question is, where do you think it's going? I mean, I think climate change presents an interesting, especially question in pacing, you know, that is the central problem in science and in storytelling for climate change, right, is, you know, we've had climate change before, but it's the rate at which it is occurring that creates the conditions for improbable encounters and events, and you know, that's also going to change the way we talk about you know, global health and the climate crisis generally. And I you know, obviously there's no answer. You know, can't predict the future, and that's ultimately the problem here. But you know, it's what do you think? What are you noticing in your field? You know, where do you think storytelling might be going?
I mean, I know for me, it's changing from the speculative to, you know, what's happening right now, and that pace is going to pick up.
Yeah.
As we move forward in time and the realities of climate change become more and more apparent. I've also noticed that it's changing from ecological impact to economic impact, at least where I am in the reporting that I'm seeing. Yeah, recently, one of the outlets that I often work for just published a series of reports on how climate change just this year had a huge economic impact on the recreational industries in Michigan where I live. And we're going to continue to see reporting like that. Yeah, I think that's what we're really going to start to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the sort of reactionary way humans apparently deal with things is when we get hit in the pocketbook, we tend to like do more stuff and pay more attention, unfortunately. And so, yeah, I was talking to somebody else about this, that it feels like, and this is going to be a very America-centric sort of, speculation, but we like to invent our way out of things, instead of prevent them from happening. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that as well. The speculative part is no longer going to be about what are the bad things that are going to happen, because they're happening. The speculative part's going to be about, will this be the thing that saves us, you know? And you see that starting to happen, I think, more in the reporting, you know, like this new technique might be what is going to bottle up all the CO2 and we're going to send it to space, or we're going to, you know, I don't know, whatever, bury it in the ground or buried in the sea, like with kelp farms. Yeah, that was one that I saw recently. So yeah, that's where the speculation's going, I think.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think I'll open it up to audience questions. If folks want to step up to the mic, we have, I believe, 15 more minutes left. So if people are interested or have questions for Aaron and Andy, please step up right now. There are mics all along the aisle here.
Hello, well, I'm Diego from Peru, and I found the last video very interesting because, well, there is well-reported evidence about the harsh and slavery-like conditions that some of these squid ships has, well, for these fishermen. But this video also made me think about the other side of the coin, that is the predation of the Peru, in this case, the old South American Sea. For example, at least for Peru in 2022, it has been estimated that only from illegal squid, these squid activities, 50,000 tons of squid has been lost for Peru. And in money value, that's around, it has been estimated around $80 million. And well, that's economical losses for the country, and also can threat food security also for the country. So that's very interesting about the video. You see how the harsh conditions of these people, but also the environmental impact of that.
Yeah, and that speaks to, like, if we're thinking about like the different ways to tell these stories. If you look at just that one story, you've got the personal issue when you talk about the perspective of the fishermen, but you've got the, you know, there's so many other slices there. The ecological story of the squid, the economic story of the impact for the people of Peru in that case, or perhaps the economic impact or advantage that it has for perhaps like the consumer who's getting cheap squid. You know, there has to be that sort of connection as well, so that it's not just a, oh wow, that's really sad, but it's also like, hey, if I eat squid, where am I buying my squid, and how did it get there? And you know, where is the like look in the mirror aspect of the story? I think is an important anchoring point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, how do you not shove solutions in people's face, but provide? Yeah, that's which is I think been a challenge for a lot of outlets recently. Do we have any other audience questions?
Kind of. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
We can.
Yeah.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, I feel like there's a lot of interest in social impact entertainment. We're in Los Angeles. A few months ago, I went to a conference on SIE, social impact entertainment. And there's really a call to integrate this a lot more with public health, with filmmakers, with documentaries, and to incorporate a social impact campaign. So I'm curious how you both think about that, and even just the question that you were asking about, kind of, is there a call to action? Should that be in our faces a little bit more? Should that be pulling on our heartstrings so then we look for a call to action? And that could be a room of people in public health. Is this around behavior change communications? Is this around advocacy? It's kind of, how do you guys think about that, and how should we be monitoring this? Should we be, again, kind of making this more implicit or as explicit, given the needs and the changes that we need to see across all of these issues?
Well, I think a direct call to action moves your piece from documentary into advocacy or marketing. And so I try and stay away from them as much as possible. Often when pieces are published, there's sometimes a short write-up, especially when you make a video, there's a short write-up that goes with it. Sometimes the outlet will put resources in there that people can follow up with. But in my own work, I try and avoid a direct call.
I've done, like in my professional career, I have done stuff where I think it's the more appropriate call to action. When I've previously worked and done like nonprofit work where I was working on a campaign for, and I think that's where, if there's a spectrum, right? Because sometimes those things, like it'll be a nonprofit group has an issue that they want awareness around, and then they will commission, a documentary about it. And that's it. And then the documentary will exist as a documentary, and then they will use that as part of their, something else that has a call to action. Or sometimes there will just be, straight, as you would say, like marketing, but in this case on behalf of, a public awareness campaign about some aspect of health, or and I think that's entirely appropriate. It is interesting when we look like across the spectrum of documentary. I think, Aaron, to what you're saying is like a very journalistic sense of documentary filmmaking. And, in the common parlance, I would say there is a much larger band of things that are called documentaries, which, would maybe be like move into like an opinion piece, or an editorial, as it were. And that's an interesting distinction, because when we talk about journalism, we think of maybe some more traditional values in terms of reporting, certainly when we're engaging with, what the Pulitzer Center does. But documentary filmmaking kind of gets a weird pass, or I should say, like in the public consciousness, will be things that are strictly editorial, I guess I believe that as long as it's factual, that's my most deeply held belief about what documentary filmmaking is, and then where you go from there. And if you are putting in a call to action, I think is kind of certainly people who have a call to action, you should be using these tools, and putting filmmakers together in whether it's an opportunity to work on a documentary that you want something that has awareness around is valuable. I don't know if that really answers your question, but symposiums, I'm for them, if that's what you're saying. That's what you're asking. That's why we're here.
Do we have any other audience questions? I do have one closing question for both of you, and that is, what are you reading or watching or listening to that's really exciting you, that perhaps feels innovative, something that
Good one.
you'd like to share with folks, or yeah.
It's top of my mind. I just watched 20 Days in Mariupol. It's nominated for an Oscar this year. And in terms of swinging things towards like pure journalism reporting and being made into a feature documentary, which is achieving, some notoriety at this moment, it kind of converges in all those ways. It's a very difficult watch, so just warning, but it is online. You can find it currently on YouTube, the entire documentary, which is how I watched it. And just the level of so I would call it like cinema verite of like what it was like to be there in that moment. It was an Associated Press journalist who stayed when all the other international, and he's Ukrainian, stayed when all the other international reporters left once the city became encircled, and was there for 20 days. And it's very raw. And if you want to see life as it happens in a war zone in Ukraine, it was very effective.
So strangely, Andrew has watched the most modern documentary that you can see, and I have been doing exactly the opposite. I have gone all the way back to the very beginning of documentary filmmaking 100 years ago and been watching what those filmmakers were doing. Some of the very early science films that were made by a French filmmaker named Jean Panlev in the 1920s through to the early 1940s. And another filmmaker named Joris Ivens, who made one of the earliest recognized documentaries called Rain, in which it's what was called a city symphony that showed what a rainstorm in Amsterdam. Just to see how they put their films together and what lessons I can learn from them.
Well, thank you both for being here tonight. It's been a pleasure. For those of you who are interested, please, you're welcome to visit the Pulitzer Center site, www.pulitzercenter.org. You can see all sorts of stories on public health, and also there are more projects by Aaron and Andy on our site. It's been a pleasure to have you this long. I know I'll let you go soon, so feel free to come up too afterwards. There are few enough folks here, so we'll hang out for a bit. But yeah, thank you, Andy and Aaron.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.